Greetings to all the students, teachers, parents, and interested members of the public right across the Caribbean who have joined us this morning for our 8th in the series of schools history lectures on the topic today, labor movements and unionization in the 20th century, a regional perspective. A special welcome to the chair of the St. Lucia National Reparation Committee, to members of all the collaborating agencies to whom you'll be introduced by Mr. Bousquet in a while, and also to the chair of the CARICOM Reparation Commission, the members of the CARICOM Reparation Commission, to Dr. Sandra Gift, who has so far moderated, I think, about 2 of our lectures, and the technical team at the Open Campus, the planning committee, of course, including John Shorter, and the communication and PR team. Greetings to distinguished speakers, Mr. David Abdullah and Mr. George Goddard. I will introduce them more fully in a while. I hope everyone is keeping safe, because this is a very interesting time in which we're living, and everyone has to really observe the COVID-19 protocols. May is celebrated as Workers' Month in the Caribbean. It is a month in which we recall the weeks and months of militant action in the 1930s, when the working people of the Caribbean confronted the colonial government and demanded for themselves rights which they had been denied after a whole century of petitions, such as the right to form trade unions and engage in collective bargaining, and created the foundations of the modern Caribbean. Our 2 presenters will delve further into the causes and consequences of these labor protests, as well as the contemporary conditions of workers, especially at this time of COVID-19. Before that, though, I wish to pay my respects to all those who were killed and injured in these protests in the 1930s, because they stood up for workers' rights and their rights. The 14 killed, the 41 injured by gunshots, and the 139 otherwise injured island-wide in Jamaica, among them 16-year-old Moses Perrin, Basil Mackenzie, Hubert Hewitt, Medora Williams, Elsie Powell, and Hutchinson, who received 2 shots in the arm, and Irene Campbell, who was shot in the back, and those killed, including Kathleen Martin and her unborn child. The roots of the 1938 labor protests can be traced to the hardship experienced by the unemployed, as well as by workers, peasants, and small farmers after the abolition of enslavement, which went unrelieved for an entire century, the century of apartheid. The newly freed people, and later along with indentured workers, had sought to transform themselves into an independent community of peasants and small farmers. The growth of a small landholding class, however, was inimical to the interests of the big landowners, who constantly required a cheap supply of labor and sought to elevate the needs of big capital over the needs of the peasantry and small farmers. It was only a matter of time before the displaced peasantry, small farmers, and the rural unemployed would confront the colonial state to demand a solution to these socioeconomic problems. Even 12-year-old Joyce Gooden of Jamaica understood the struggle, speaking from a platform at North Parade on May 17, 1938, according to one of the newspapers at the time, about the lack of education in Jamaica, and exhorting the meeting to see to it that government provided free books for children who one day would be the mass of this country. She told the crowd, "My school brethren need a leader, and I am determined as one of them to lead, to acquire that which is for their future benefit." That is our objective in this lecture series, to acquire that which is for their future benefit, for our students, of course. Before we get into the lecture for today, let me ask Mr. Earl Bousquet to give the official welcome, but let me tell you something about him. Journalist Earl Bousquet is the current chair of the St. Lucia National Committee for Reparations and an active member of the CARICOM Reparations Commission. An activist, he has over 3 decades of ongoing experience in newspaper, radio, and the television in St. Lucia, Grenada, and Guyana. A recipient of the St. Lucia National Medal of Honor, Gold, for his contribution to journalism, Mr. Bousquet is a former press secretary to Prime Minister Dr. Kennedy Anthony. He's a founding member of the Workers' Revolutionary Movement in St. Lucia, and therefore was intimately connected to the period of progressive left activism and Marxist movement building during the 1970s and the 1980s in the Caribbean. He has a wide knowledge of the history of radical politics in the 1970s and the Grenada Revolution, 1979 to 1983. According to a 2019 published interview with him, he has always emphasized the need for Caribbean solidarity among progressives and the constant review of the effectiveness of creative application of social and political theory. It is now my pleasure to ask him to give the official welcome and to say a little bit about why the St. Lucia Reparation Committee thought it critical to forge links with other entities to conceptualize and implement this lecture series. Mr. Bousquet, you have the floor.
Thank you, Professor Shepherd, and welcome to all to this 8th in the virtual Caribbean Schools History and Reparations Lecture Series presented by the St. Lucia National Reparations Committee in collaboration with the Center for Reparations Research, the CRR of the University of the West Indies. Welcome especially to students, teachers, and principals, as well as to parents and guardians, teachers and students regionally and in the diaspora, especially those under lockdown today. As with all our topics, today is aimed at history students at secondary schools across CARICOM, preparing for upcoming exams, which will again be held both virtually and face-to-face. Likewise, our presenters were carefully selected for the wealth of knowledge to be shared on the topic of labor movements and unionization across the Caribbean in the 20th century. The month of May has very many significant dates worthy of observance and commemoration, ranging from Indian Arrival Days to African Liberation Day. But the date that embraces most what we are doing this morning is the 1st of May, and that is observed regionally and internationally as International Workers' Day, or May Day, a holiday in most Caribbean states. Indeed, it was on May 1st, 1888, that several workers were shot dead for withdrawing their labor in the American city of Chicago, which sparked a national movement with international support that led May Day as the day when the world would thereafter pay attention annually and give due respect every year to the importance of workers, but not just on that day, but on every day. Unfortunately, the important roles of trade unions and workers in Caribbean history are still not yet sufficiently documented from a Caribbean perspective or understood or accepted regionally today for reasons ranging from basic intent to deliberate obfuscation. But trade unions and workers played leading roles in development of Caribbean societies, best seen in the results of the 1938 revolts by workers across the entire British West Indies that Professor Shepherd just referred to, which led to the establishment of trade unions across the region, which unions in turn established political parties, which in turn demanded the rights of poor black, brown, and non-white majorities across the West Indies to vote. The leading role of the 1938 riots in shaking the foundations of British colonialism was forever documented by Sir Arthur Lewis in his seminal book, Labor in the West Indies, published in 1939. Trade unionists and labor leaders played vital roles before and after the Second World War that forever changed and shaped Caribbean society, including how we know it today. But those aspects of our history are not sufficiently documented in our history books. It is to address that gap, as Professor Shepherd asked me to explain. It is to address that gap in documentation and sharing of the knowledge of important aspects of labor movements and unionization in the 20th century that we have invited these two distinguished veteran Caribbean trade unionists, Mr. Abdullah and Mr. Goddard, who spent a working lifetime not just leading trade unions, but also specializing in workers' education. Professor Shepherd will introduce them formally, but each of these gentlemen did, decades ago, in the trade union movement, what we are doing here today, which is sharing new and old and or different perspectives on not only the important roles played by trade unions in bringing benefits to workers, but also the need to look beyond just the economic benefits of trade union membership and the common experiences and roles of workers in all countries. Together, our two presenters share several decades, almost a century of experience, I would dare say, in trade unionism across the Caribbean community. They will definitely share with us aspects of the roles played by the national and regional labor movements up and down the Caribbean and across from Jamaica in the north through to St. Lucia and Barbados down to Grenada and Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and Suriname. Meanwhile, three short points before I go. Breaking news. The St. Lucia NRC has the pleasure of welcoming St. Lucia's Calabash TV as a new partner and stakeholder, as a consequence of which today's lecture presentations are being recorded for replay on TV to St. Lucian audiences. And as with our as with our last National Reparations lecture on Thursday last, every following lecture will also be carried live by Calabash TV across St. Lucia. So please inform fellow students at home and especially those without devices, as well as parents, guardians, teachers, and principals of other schools island-wide that the Caribbean Schools Reparation and History lectures are now live on St. Lucia's Calabash TV and no longer only online. As with Professor Shepherd's Talking History program and a Nationwide FM in Jamaica also taking these lectures to Jamaican schools, we look forward to more national stations joining to take these school broadcasts to homes without devices and to more people across the region also interested in learning and living our history in these new times. As we approach the end of our first year of this Caribbean Schools History Lecture Series, with the cooperation of Ministries of Education in the Windward Islands, Dominica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and the Grenadines, and Grenada, Carriacou, and Petit Martinique, we also look to more ministries, schools, and students joining us for our June lecture on the usual fourth Thursday in the month, that is June 23rd coming. And finally, for that final session on June 23rd, before schools close for holidays, we absolutely need special feedback from students, teachers, and principals ahead of planning for the next series, especially as it relates to increasing the level of direct participation by schools and students. The St. Lucia NRC, the CRR, as well as NRCs attached to the CARICOM Reparations Commission, will be engaging schools and students directly in the month ahead. But today, now, please do continue to use the chat room and other facilities available on the platforms on your devices to comment, ask questions, and offer advice on where we go from here in our second year. Welcome again, and thanks for your usual attention to my usual 1,000 words, hoping they will have put the rest of today's session in perspective. Back to you, Professor Shepherd.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bousquet. I wish we had more time to actually listen to you and to listen to all the wealth of information that you have. I think you will have to give one of these lectures one of these days, maybe the last lecture before we close out the series. Thank you very much for telling us that Calabash TV is on board. And may I just say to the students that Talking History on Nationwide 90 FM is not just for Jamaican students. It actually has a global listenership. So everyone in the region can join. And yes, we are very pleased. I'm the host of Talking History, and I'm very pleased that the station has come on board and that many other people will be able to hear this lecture. So Mr. Bousquet has already told you a little bit about our two speakers, but just allow me to introduce our first speaker, Mr. David Abdullah, Trinidadian economist and labor and political activist. He is, as I said, an economist, trained and a labor and political activist. He is a founding member of the political party, the Movement for Social Justice, or MSJ, and has been its leader from 2012 to present. Mr. Abdullah has also spent 39 years at the Oilfield Workers Trade Union, that's from 1977 to 2016, and is a former president of the Federation of Independent Trade Unions and the NGOs FITUN, and was the industrial relations advisor to the West Indies Players Association. So it's my pleasure to give him the floor and to have him share with us for the next 15 minutes his wide experience on this topic. Please listen to him now, Mr. Abdullah.
Good morning. Thank you very much to you, Professor Shepherd, for that very kind introduction, and good morning to two colleagues of mine, George Goddard and Bousquet, who I've known for quite a number of years. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to share some thoughts this morning on the issue of the labor movements and unionization in the 20th century. I wanted to add, because I know that was part of an earlier theme of this lecture series, that the labor movements really were the ones who struck a blow first, or in an organized way, against colonialism and imperialism in the 20th century. I am going to very quickly run through some slides, which I hope that you are able to see fairly clearly on your screen. And I'm really going to focus on the early part of the history of the labor movement. I think that certainly when we look at the current issues, we could pick that up perhaps in the question and answer session. The labor movement, as Earl was saying, and it's interesting, both Professor Shepherd and Earl referred to the 1930s. And I want to say that the month of June is very important for Trinidad and Tobago in terms of the 1930s, because June 19th, 1937 was the day when the general strike started in Trinidad and became not just a general strike in Trinidad, not Tobago, interestingly, in Trinidad, but also was an anti-colonial revolt, because there were a lot of actions, which I don't have time to go into, but many people died, 14 people died over a 3-week period, a number of people were injured and arrested and so on. And there were 2 British naval battleships, the Ajax and the Exeter, that had to come to Trinidad to suppress the workers' revolt at that time. But in 1926, in other words, just after the First World War, we had the rise of the labor movement in the Caribbean. In British Guyana, you had the British Guyana Workers' Trade Union organization led by Harold Critchlow. And then in Trinidad, you had the Trinidad Working Men's Association, which was revived around 1914, 1915 by dock workers and led a 1919 strike that became a rolling general strike in Trinidad between late 1919 and the early part of 1920. By 1926, Sorry, I said George, it should have been Hubert Nathaniel Critchlow was the British Guyana Labour leader, my apologies. He then organized the first meeting of British Guyana and the West Indies labor movement. There weren't many registered trade unions, but it was really a labor movement in 1926 in Georgetown. There was a 1932 conference in Dominica, one in 1938 in Trinidad, 1945 in Barbados. The Caribbean Labor Congress was officially established, and then there was a very important conference in Jamaica in 1948. The 1930s, as has been already stated, saw strikes all over the region. 1935 in St. Kitts, there was a hunger march in Trinidad in 1935 and an oil workers strike. Strikes in British Guyana, disturbances in St. Vincent, a coal strike in St. Lucia, which Earl and George could probably tell us more about. And then 1937, the general strike and revolt in Trinidad, strikes in Barbados, British Guyana, St. Lucia, Jamaica, the general strike and revolt in Jamaica, and again in British Guyana. So right throughout the region, and if we were to expand it, there were also protests in non-English speaking Caribbean countries as well. And this was the fallout from the collapse of Wall Street of 1929 and the general crisis of capitalism of the end of the 20s and early 30s. Now, I'm quoting here now from that important book, Labor in the West Indies, by St. Lucian Sir Arthur Lewis, written in 1939. And he said here that the 1930s was nothing short of a revolution. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but he was saying that on the political front, nothing short of a revolution has occurred. And governments were forced, British colonial governments, of course, were forced to adopt all sorts of measures to deal with the demands of the workers. But he went on to say, very importantly, that it was mainly on the development of this united labor movement that future progress in the West Indies depends. And that constitutional reform, which would enable it to get into power, is the first aim of the labor movement. And one should try and read that, what was in effect in those days, a real-time analysis of the events of 1937, of the 1930s, written by Arthur Lewis, because he goes through each territory in the West Indies, British West Indies, one by one, and describes the economic, social, political conditions, as well as the details of the protest actions. Now, Susan Craig, in another book, important book, Smiles and Blood, written about the 1937 revolt and general strike in Trinidad, said that the workers struck a blow at property, thus striking a blow at the state and the whole structure of colonialism. And this is why I wanted to link it with the whole notion of the workers' movement being against colonialism and imperialism. And there was, this then led to, as Lewis himself had said, to labor being thrust into the political arena. And I'll come back to that issue of why the British authorities wanted to focus attention on the industrial aspects. The agenda of the 1938 conference here in Trinidad, in the resolution, which is quoted in detail in full in Arthur Lewis's book, Labor in the West Indies, identifies a whole series of reforms. But interestingly, there's federation on full elective control and adult suffrage. Now, there was a slogan from as far back as 1932, the Dominica Conference, I believe, where the labor movement said, no adult franchise, the right to vote, without self-government, which was the first step towards independence, and no self-government without federation. So they saw the success of democracy, the right to vote, only in the context of independence, self-determination, and that independence and self-determination could only be successful in the context of a federated West Indies and not as individual island, or case of Guyana, Belize, and so on, land territories. So that was very important. But they had very far-reaching economic proposals like nationalization of sugar factories and so on, dismemberment of the plantation system and creation of peasant cooperatives, and many other things like that. So there were very radical and far-reaching proposals and an agenda. Now, 1945 Manchester Pan-African Congress, which in my view was the most important Pan-African Congress, organized by the Trinidadian George Padmore, in London, but with support from Trinidadian CLR James, who is based in the United States, and which involved people like Kwame Nkrumah and others. That Pan-African Congress was actually attended by many Caribbean or West Indian labor leaders, including the then President General of the Oilfields Workers Trade Union of Trinidad and Tobago, John Rojas, and many others. And so the trade union movement was clearly linked, the progressive trade union movement was clearly identified with the general anti-colonial, anti-imperialist struggle right throughout the British Empire at that time. And this is a quote from one of the resolutions of that 1945 Pan-African Congress, which is published in another important book, the 1945 Manchester Pan-African Congress Revisited, published by New Beacon Books in 1995. But you will see there that colonial workers must be in the front of the battle against imperialism and so on. Your weapons, the strike and the boycott are invincible. So that's another very important thing for us to know. Now, there were two agendas at all times, and Susan Craig points it out very, very clearly. The agenda of the British colonial powers of imperialism, and then the workers' agenda. And what the British colonial authorities wanted is for the workers' movement to be channeled into what they called responsible trade unionism, which responsible trade unionism would be focused only on the industrial aspects of trade unionism and represented workers, collective bargaining, and so on, negotiating for better wages and conditions of work. But they didn't want the labor movement to focus with radical leaders in major struggles to break the power of the economic power of the plantation system and the political power of colonialism and imperialism. And there was this tension between those two tendencies in the labor movement have remained, in my view, up to today. This was another quote from Lewis. And then there were, yes, major gains as a result of the struggle of the 1930s, social gains of education, healthcare, housing, and so on, labor reforms, political reforms. We got independence, we have formal democracy. But I want to say that the more radical agenda has been lost. And a number of people have spoken to this, and maybe in the question and answer period, because my time is getting close to an end. A number of people have spoken to this, but certainly Professor Rex Nettleford, as quoted in an important book, Sovereignty of the Imagination by George Lamming. Professor Rex Nettleford, former Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, said this: "I have a deep concern that trade unions are being pushed further and further on the periphery of all social and economic arrangements throughout the Caribbean region for the convenience of the historical plantocracy, the enduring commission agency class, and the newly arrived technocracy." Now, that's a very powerful statement. And I think Mr. Lawrence Nurse, who was a lecturer at Cave Hill in Barbados, in an essay titled Organized Labor in the Caribbean Commonwealth, said the following: "The 1930s represented an effective challenge which brought together sectional interests, proletariat, peasants, and members of an emergent middle class. The proletariat and peasants entered the struggle in protest against the social economic deprivation. The middle class, though arguing for the franchise and right of political rights, was interested in political power for itself. Organized labor became the major force in the democratization of Caribbean societies. They challenged the insult of racial discrimination, which retarded the progress of the Black middle class. They fought for the extension of the franchise until universal adult franchise was achieved. They secured the legal rights of the trade union in a series of constitutional reforms, which led ultimately to political independence. But all these forces served well the political interests of the middle class. Political leaders gave their approval to a particular type of union, which was referred to as responsible unionism, and institutionalized the Westminster two-party model of government in the region. And so I want to suggest that trade unions and the labor movement, in a sense, have lost focus and have lost the kind of historical roots that they had, and understanding that their role is not simply to represent their members for better wages and conditions of work. Yes, that is a key and core function of the unions, but the labor movement has a much broader mandate, which is to struggle for the end to the economic, or to transform the economic relations of power and the political relations of power, where only a few control power and wealth and income, and the majority are still relegated to being bystanders. And therefore, to link it to reparations, in my view, labor must be in the forefront of the struggle for reparations if we are to reverse the reality of the historical plantocracy, the enduring commission and agency class, and the newly arrived technocracy continuing to control our countries. And I will stop there. I hope I have given some insights. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that presentation. And you know, as you mentioned, the casualty, the numbers who died in Trinidad and Tobago, you said 14. I'm thinking how coincidental, because in Jamaica, 14 were killed as well. And maybe it's time that we do a comparative analysis of the casualty across the Caribbean. But you mentioned a couple of books, and I wanted to also tell our students that there are two other books that they could read for this topic. One is On the March, Labor Rebellions in the British Caribbean, 1934 to 39. And this is by O. Nigel Bolland. I'm going to ask if we could put this up in the chat so our students can see. And the second one is called, and some of our students who do CSEC would be familiar with this one, Freedoms Won, Caribbean Emancipations, Ethnicities and Nationhood by Hilary Beckles and Vereen Shepherd. And again, a post-slavery and post-independence assessment of the Caribbean. It's now time to introduce our second speaker, Mr. George Goddard from St. Lucia. He's a St. Lucian trade unionist, social activist, and poet. I wonder if he has done any poem on this topic. George Goddard is an industrial relations practitioner and the immediate past secretary of the St. Lucia National Workers Union, one of the foremost trade unions in St. Lucia. And he's as I said, he's a poet, a writer, and he the holder of an MBA degree from Cavell School of Business at the University of the West Indies. So, Mr. Goddard, you have the floor. You have your 15 minutes. Thank you. You're muted. Perhaps you could unmute, please. And you have to start again.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Shepherd, and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to address this gathering. Now, I will continue, I think, from a slightly different angle from where David Abdullah left off. We often use the labor uprisings of the 1930s in the Caribbean, as we have done here today, as the reference point for the development of organized labor in the region, and so it should be. And there is a tendency to overlook the critical significance of the development of Caribbean labor from its oppressive origins and its broader implications for the issues of contemporary Caribbean living. The development from its beginnings in slavery and indentureship, its genesis in the plantation system of labor and economy, and how these determined to a large extent the resistance to that system of coercion and oppression. These are all basal to an understanding of today's Caribbean and the problems with which we must engage today. The resistance, and very, very important, the resistance included the development of a peasantry, a proletariat, or a working class, not a proletariat in the European sense as such, trade unions, and trade union connected political parties. Indeed, the plantation system of labor and economy, how this influenced the character of our institutions of organized labor, political parties, and governance, and how it continues to influence our engagement with the issues of development and underdevelopment in the Caribbean remain critical. At the very onset, labor relations in the Caribbean, if you can call pre-emancipation conditions labor relations, perhaps not strictly so, but these relations were based on one of the most intensive forms of the extraction of surplus value, or perhaps more loosely profit, that had been devised until then. That is the plantation system. This is a system based on the most coercive forms of labor, these being slavery and indentureship. So we saw the enslavement of the indigenous populations, followed by the wholesale importation of captive labor from the African continent. There was also, from the inception, a system of indentured European labor, which would draw from the most oppressed sections of the European working class as well. These persons were enticed to come out to the Caribbean under quite onerous conditions themselves. Quite often, these workers, the European ones that is, would become the skilled and semi-skilled labor of the plantations, while the mass of Africans were the brawn and muscle of plantation labor. Brawn and muscle of plantation labor. By then, much of the indigenous populations had either been wiped out by European diseases that had been introduced when the Europeans came in, or ethnically cleansed. Yes, ethnically cleansed. After 1834, to compensate for movement away from the plantations in many instances, we saw the mass importation of indentured labor. Most of this labor came from Asia, but large numbers came as well from Guinea in West Africa. And quite often it is overlooked that a lot of indentured labor, certainly I know in the case of St. Lucia, did come from Guinea in West Africa after the ending of slavery, or after what we call emancipation. They came mainly, as I say, from Guinea. These Guineans were the people to whom we refer in St. Lucia as Neg Guinea, that is in our St. Lucian Creole. And they were also a very militant group in the final analysis, although they came after slavery and they came as indentured labor. The conditions of indentureship in terms of the treatment meted out to the workers were not very far removed from the abuse that obtained under slavery. An oppressive system of what, to all intents and purposes, was 19th century apartheid was quite brutal. What developed, therefore, was the most abusive form of labor exaction, in which the broad mass of the producers of wealth were the property of the owners of capital and were to be used and disposed of at their will. It was in these dehumanizing conditions that Caribbean economies and Caribbean social relations were born. It also meant that by the time of the nominal emancipation in that part of the Caribbean colonized by Britain in the period 1834-1838, that we had what was an overwhelmingly captive labor force for whom the conditions of control and abuse did not, in fact, materially change. What we saw was a transition from a social construct in which the population was legally property to one of veritable apartheid, with all the connotations of economic deprivation and race oppression. Apartheid did not begin with South Africa, nor has it ended with South Africa, if you have been following our news recently. Perhaps we should note here that the Nobel Prize winning economist, who has been quoted here before, Sir Arthur Lewis, writing in 1938, 1939, noted that even before the emancipation, the slaves rebelled frequently. And throughout the last 100 years, that is leading up to the 1930s, there have been isolated strikes, riots, political organization, and even trade unions. But not until recent years has there been that which can be called a movement, unquote. That was Arthur Lewis. But what was happening is that the working class was rising, the peasantry were rising, but they were learning lessons, the lesson of not being too well organized. And so that would lead in the 1930s and thereafter to better organization and, of course, to a lot of what David referred to earlier. So it is in recognition of the continuity of this movement, its origin and development, that our education system, in my view, should be redirected towards the sensitizing of our people, the sensitizing of our people to the nature and the depth of the task of decolonization. The fact that decolonization is, in fact, unfinished business, and that reparatory justice is one of the many streams that we need to pursue in the ongoing task of decolonization. Decolonization, national liberation, and the battling of the marginalization of large sections of our working class and people cannot be ignored, despite nominal independence. For some 100 years, the post-emancipation colonial system held sway and was characterized, among other things, by, very importantly, land starvation, low wages, discriminatory rents and taxes on the emerging peasantry, and what Nigel Bolland, who I also think was referred to here earlier, has described as an authoritarian dispensation, which he argues still characterizes to a significant degree the social discourse and the power relations in our democratic and popular institutions. Trade unions and other popular-based parties that have emerged out of the foment of the 1930s, and even prior to this, seem to bear this out. Herein lies much of the power, much of the governance issues in today's Caribbean. Our education systems have promoted the idea that the concepts and values of human rights, labor rights, democracy, accountability, etc., are concepts with which we have been gifted by Europe, which of course includes North America. This has tended to obfuscate or to shade and to make dark the fact that the most anti-democratic characteristics, many of which still infuse and define our social and economic relations, have been incubated in these plantation-based authoritarian and exploitative relations. They have been incubated in these relations, and that the globalized production system, and right here, right now, from the 20th into the 21st century, that the globalized production systems, inclusive of labor, which are designed to intensify the exploitation of labor worldwide, are in fact an adaptation of capital to changing geopolitical and technological realities. The so-called level playing field of the WTO, we have discovered through the decimation of our bananas, our sugar, other industries within the Caribbean and in the third world in general, are anything but level. Even when we have sought to enter the financial services sector, that the West has dominated with the rise of finance capital, we have found that the rules were being rewritten to our disadvantage. Overnight, we found ourselves aiding and abetting money laundering, which seemed to have been all right in the heyday of the Swiss bank, etc. So, in the globalized division of labor, we continue to be hewers of wood and drawers of water. Deregulated and precarious labor, while it has also affected the so-called countries of advanced capitalism, has disproportionately become a scourge on our backs. So we are faced with a battle on several fronts. Our understanding of these issues is totally necessary to help us understand why we must follow many strategies, including the pursuance of reparatory justice. One of the demands for reparatory justice, which is particularly attractive to me, is the idea of investing in our cultural institutions. It has been noted that while the neo-colonizers have always placed great emphasis on their museums, research centers, theaters, arts and performing spaces, these have been discouraged and sidelined in the Caribbean as being of marginal developmental value. But these, along with science and technology, must be at the heart of a new education. These are a veritable returning to the source. To quote Amilcar Cabral, that significant leader of the national liberation movement in Africa of the 60s and 70s, the 1960s and 70s. The CARICOM Reparatory Justice Commission proposes that, quote, persistent racial victimization of the descendants of slavery and genocide is the root cause of our suffering today, unquote. On this basis, the many interrelated issues that reparatory justice has brought to the fore must be addressed. And the thread that runs through all of these issues is the imperative to grasp these in the many facets of their interrelatedness. And perhaps nothing speaks to the centrality of a wider and deeper grasp of these issues among our populations than the remaking of our education systems in recognition of this. For it is among our young populations who have come under the acculturating influences of North America, Europe, and the geopolitical construct of the West, even more thoroughly and insidiously than in the classical colonialist days, that the work must be done. Many of the lessons that we thought we had learned in the era of Black Power, national democratic thinking, the national liberation movement, socialism with a Caribbean particularity, all of these seem to have been subverted and overtaken by neoliberal thinking, even at the level of many of our present-day intellectuals and academics. We have been led to believe that demands for reparatory justice seek to do nothing but beg for handouts from our former colonial masters. Some argue that the true mettle of our independence is called into question when we look for these so-called handouts. They go further to justify their arguments with the charge that many of our political leaders would simply use these financial outlays made available in this regard to further entrench themselves. It is because such arguments may seem plausible and even acceptable to many that an education system which will explore to the fullest the dehumanizing, socially debilitating, and economically disadvantageous consequences of colonialism, slavery, and genocide, which stubbornly persist. It is because of this that it is an imperative. The stubborn persistence of these ideas, which seek to absolve the perpetrators of these injustices of their responsibility. This is no accident. They have regenerated themselves through the education systems that colonialism has bequeathed us, and the dominance of the colonizers' narratives of our history, through the system, as well as through their control of the dissemination of ideas and information through the corporate media. I would also like to add here in closing that these changes in the organization and content of our education must take into account that we must build the broadest support of reparatory justice among our own people, even as we seek to confront the intransigence of European resistance to the idea. The deepest and broadest solidarity at home is critical. The descendants of the Middle Passage are not the only ones whose development has been stunted and distorted by the relations of inequality that persist in the Caribbean. The descendants of those who suffered indigenous genocide and the descendants of indentureship and the melding of our populations is the basis for a solidarity that will make the movement for reparatory justice all the more effective. In other words, we must employ both education and solidarity as potent weapons against the interests which will not recognize their culpability in our chronic underdevelopment issues and which stubbornly resist the demands of the reparations movement, the trade union movement. Schooled as it is in the lessons of solidarity, is a partner as well placed as any other to lead or to lend leadership to the movement. Thank you for the opportunity to share these ideas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Goddard. Thank you for that spirited defense of the reparation movement and for clearly articulating why it is that all should come on board. Because in the contemporary world, we can't even, as Jamaicans would say, diss anyone, mash anybody to, turn over them pot of soup on the roadside when they're trying to make a living without people demanding apology and compensation. So it boggles the mind why it is that reparation for colonial wrongs and continuing harm, by the way, should not be something that we defend and we support. Thank you also for reminding us that the struggles of the workers and the leaders of the trade union movement, and in fact, the franchise movement that came out of that, were not the only ones. They didn't suddenly rise up in the 1930s from Belize, St. Kitts and Nevis to Jamaica. But that our struggle, the labor movement, has a long genealogy that started with conquest and colonization and the resistance of indigenous peoples, continued with the resistance of enslaved Africans, the resistance of indentured workers, Indians and Chinese. And in the post-slavery period of apartheid, you are correct, apartheid was not a movement only confined to South Africa. There was a century of apartheid in our own region. And we know that the protests continued even after emancipation. In Vox Populi, the Morant Bay War, the Confederation riots, and so many others. In the struggle of women for gender equity in wages and occupation. So thank you for those reminders. The floor is now open to questions from our students and parents and teachers. Please post your questions on YouTube and Facebook, and they will come to me. I will pose them to the speakers. Until we see your questions coming in, may I just ask and in fact, maybe I should have added, you say that apartheid is also going on now. Yesterday for Africa Day, the president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, reminded us about the ongoing vaccine apartheid right now, which is affecting countries to the south. So apartheid is alive and we need to continue the struggle. But I want to ask each of you, maybe starting with David and then going to George. In this time of COVID-19, do you think that the trade unions are as active as they should be in defending the rights of workers who have been so displaced? So I'll pose that. David, you can start, George can follow, and then I'll see if there are any questions that come through for us.
Thank you very much for that question, Professor. Let me just say that in terms of apartheid, the issue of Palestine must also be front and center, because the way in which the state of Israel has treated Palestinians is virtually the same as apartheid. But that's for another discussion on another time. But with respect to COVID-19, I can't speak about the trade unions in other parts of the Caribbean at this time because, of course, I retired from active trade unionism for 5 years now. I can say, though, what has been happening in Trinidad and Tobago. And the unions have sought here to engage the government and employers with respect to representing workers. But what we really don't have, and the unions left the tripartite process a couple months ago because they were of the view, which view I support, that the tripartite process was not coming to grips with the really fundamental questions of how do you share the burden of adjustment that is necessary within the context of COVID. In other words, the COVID pandemic has caused our economies to shrink. In case of Trinidad and Tobago, we are now under state of emergency, there's significant lockdown and so on. Many sectors are closed at this point in time, and that happened last year. A large part of the region, tourism has been hugely affected because of the problems of COVID. And so our economies have shrunk. But with a shrinking pie, the question arises, what about equity and some sense of equality in how the burden of adjustment is to be shared? And it comes back to that quote by Nettleford that we still have the historical plantocracy and the enduring commission agency class, which controls the economy of our countries. And in that situation, those persons are not as affected as workers who lose their jobs, are losing their homes, are losing, children can't get education because they don't have devices, and a whole range of other problems like that. And there isn't a strong enough conversation around those issues. But I'm sure that is going to emerge, certainly here in Trinidad and Tobago, in the coming days and weeks as we are in this now extended second lockdown and state of emergency.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. George, your perspective on that question? You're muted. Please unmute. Mr. Goddard? Okay, please unmute. Yes? Okay.
Yes.
Perspective on the same question? Mm-hmm.
Yes, while it appears to me that throughout the Caribbean, trade unions are in fact engaging their governments and employers as far as the fallout of COVID-19 issues is concerned. All too often, I think our trade unions are following in the wake of these people. All too often, we are not setting the agenda. All too often, we just go along apparently happily with what some of our political leaderships do. For example, here in St. Lucia, we have a situation where a lot of the financial resources that have been obtained by our government for the assistance of workers who have lost their jobs have been diverted to things like infrastructural projects in anticipation of an election. Now, our trade unions have not raised their voices against that. And for crying out loud, we have people who are on the brink. We have people who cannot pay their bills. We have people who cannot eat, and yet, right, financial resources meant for assistance in this situation are being frittered away, and our trade unions have not raised their voices in this regard. So I think that trade unions must, not only in St. Lucia, throughout the Caribbean, we have to ensure that we play that frontal role that we have played historically, that we pick up the cudgels where we have left them off. We have become, I think we have become virtually acclimatized to what David referred to earlier when he said we have lost our fire. We have now become these trade unions that do not want to be too political. We just want to concern ourselves with what seems to be strictly industrial matters.
Another question is this, and I think, George, you mentioned the issue of cultural institutions and the CARICOM 10-point action plan's view on that. But closer to this topic, I'm wondering, as you look around the Caribbean, this is for both of you, as we look around the Caribbean in terms of our physical spaces, do we see the presence of these workers we're talking about on our landscape? Do we see memorials? Do we see the list of names, like a wall of honor for those who died, for those who were injured? Do we see the replacement of colonial statues and monuments with the images of our own workers and trade unionists of the past? I can tell you, for example, that we have a park called St. William Grant Park in Jamaica. St. William Grant has not been given as much notice as, say, Sir Alexander Bustamante and Norman Manley, Right Excellent Norman Manley, as people in the trade union movement. But the image of St. William Grant is not in that park. We have instead Queen Victoria. So how can we be talking about reparative justice and Workers' Week and the workers' movement and trade unionism, talk about it every year, whether in May or June, and not address iconographic and symbolic decolonization? That's a question for each of you. George, since I'm seeing your picture on the screen now, maybe you can start.
I think you have hit the nail on the head. For example, here in St. Lucia, in the early part of the 20th century, I think somewhere in the first decade, you had agricultural uprisings in the cul-de-sac and Roseau valleys, in which a number of people, a number of agricultural workers in sugarcane at the time, sugarcane was the industry, were killed. A lot of these people were actually imprisoned. Now, we have accounts and we have the names of a lot of these people. And in fact, one of them was a young girl, a girl as young as I think perhaps 13. She was at the forefront, one of those at the forefront, because child labor was a big thing then. And we have no monuments to these people. Of course, later on, we have put up a monument at the Sir George F.L. Charles Airport. Sir George F.L. Charles was one of our leading lights, our leading trade union lights, who later went on to be the first chief minister of St. Lucia. And he was a worker at the very same airport, which was then called VG Airport, which is now called Sir George F.L. Charles Airport. Outside of that, there's nothing much. Recently, what is called a royal jail has been knocked down in St. Lucia. Now, this was the very jail where these people who rose up were incarcerated. But our present government decided to knock down this jail when our historical people, right, had reached an agreement with them to sort of inculcate that building into whatever they had decided to do as far as developing that site. But they went against it and they totally destroyed that building. And so that is seriously lacking. There has not been the recognition of the struggle of the working class, which is in fact the struggle of our people for social justice and for true development.
All right, well, let me say that I think that you know, it begins, of course, with the education system. I do think, and I'm glad that we have history students here, and you know, the fact that many of our young people, unless they do history, perhaps, are not aware or not aware enough of our history. Now, the history of the region is really the history of labor, as George correctly described, in terms of all of the migrations, forced or otherwise, into the region, were the result of labor and the need for labor on the plantations and so on. And even our relations with, in the case of Trinidad, specifically with Grenada, St. Vincent, to a lesser extent, St. Lucia and so on, was labor coming into Trinidad to work in the oil fields, to later work on the US base and so on. And even our relationship with Martinique, Guadeloupe and Haiti, in the case of Trinidad, where post the French Revolution, the Spanish, who then colonized us in Trinidad, that is, brought in plantation owners and gave them land, and they had more land based upon the number of slaves they brought in. So a lot of our early histories, though Trinidad was never colonized by France, was a history of people speaking Creole. So our history is just not well known, and that is a sad reality which we have to correct in a significant way. And the academy has a critical role to play in that. In terms of labor, the leader of the Trinidad Working Men's Association from the early 1920s and a seminal labor leader right downtown Port of Spain, we do have important streets or highways named after labor leaders. There's a Uriah Butler Highway and so on, which is one of our main highways. But those are not enough to ensure in the consciousness of our people the centrality of men and women who have contributed to the development of our societies. And one of the proposals that a former President General of the ODBQ, Eric McLeod, had when he was still President General was to have a Labor Heroes Park and Museum located in Faizabad, where the June 19th, 1937 strike started. And when he became a Minister of Government, and I was a senator for a brief period in the partnership government, we did try to pursue that project, but it got abandoned and it hasn't happened. But it is something that is necessary to have a Labor Heroes Park and Museum where all the young people and others in Trinidad and Tobago and tourists and so on could come and learn about the history of labor, which would not be limited to 1937, but really the history of our societies and how we came to be here and who contributed what. One of the books that I mentioned, I didn't speak to that, was a book by Rhoda Reddock on Elmer Francois, who of course was from St. Vincent, but was one of the main leaders of the 1937 revolt here in Trinidad, leading the Northern Workers Movement. And that was important because here was this woman who was a central leader in that process of revolt in 1937. So all of this very rich history which we have, and Vereen, I mean, we could go back way back to Nani and so on, and the slave revolts. But all of this rich history that we have would infuse this generation with a sense of identity and therefore a sense of self-confidence to confront the global realities which George so correctly spoke about, with globalization and the neoliberal, and challenging and rejecting the neoliberal ideology and demanding reparatory justice and so much more. So yes, I think what you hit on was absolutely central if we are to move forward.
But we can't move forward without having Caribbean history as a compulsory subject in our schools. It is not a compulsory subject, as far as I'm aware, anywhere in the Caribbean. And therefore, if that is not corrected, we'll be here every year saying the same things, because the students would still be disconnected from their past, their history, and their identity. This doesn't happen in other countries. And therefore, we have to infuse or work with a kind of activism towards government. We cannot continue like this. Now, for the sake of the students, because of this topic is on their syllabus, there are a couple questions, but they're more contemporary. So I'm going to start with the historical ones first. So I'm asking the students to post questions that have to do with the syllabus. So there are two questions on that. One, could we at least list some of the early participants in the labor movement? You talked about Elma Francois. Were there any other names that we must leave with our students today? That's one. The second one, what is the extent of unionization today? And also, what were the challenges of the workers when they were trying to establish unions and to unionize? So if you could very quickly address those, then I will read the questions in the chat in YouTube and Facebook, which are more modern. But let's deal with the students' concerns first. So again, Mr. Goddard, would you start, please? Please unmute, Mr. Goddard.
Yeah. Would you repeat these questions, please?
Okay, sure. So one, throw in some more names of activists in the 1930s, in the movement. I mentioned some in Jamaica, and we heard about Elma Francois. Are there others names that students should know? That's one. Two, what were some of the challenges that the workers faced when they were trying to unionize? That's two. And the third one, what is the extent of unionization today? Are workers able to pay their fees and join unions? I know you said it was fading, but more concretely, what are some of the challenges today to join unions?
In terms of names, here in St. Lucia, I have mentioned, of course, George F.L. Charles, who later went on to be the first chief minister of St. Lucia. We had others like Martin Jean-Baptiste. You will note that a lot of these names are French names because of our obvious French colonization. Interestingly, we had people who were businessmen, well, involved in small business as well as in trade unions. There was a particular gentleman called Charles Augustine. He was a businessman, but he was also a trade unionist. You had a lot of this happening where people were doubling up between small business and trade union organization. So these are some of the names in St. Lucia. In St. Lucia as well, you also had people from, I think there was a guy called Brown. He was a trade union and political activist. He was actually from St. Kitts. He was later deported by the authorities. I can't remember his first name, but Brown, he was one of the activists and an activist that was stirring up quite a bit of support throughout St. Lucia. So these are some of the names that you have. A little bit more research would probably bring all that together, but these are some of the names. In terms of the challenges in establishing trade unions, one will understand that the plantocracy, the owners of the estates, they opposed the establishment of trade unions. So that in the early days, even when workers began to organize, they were not recognized from the standpoint of collective bargaining. So you might have said that you have come together to make demands. And when you made your demands, you were forced into a situation where you had to withdraw labor. And they called the withdrawal of your labor because there was not there was not a recognized trade union, although as far as the workers were concerned, they were organized. They call that a wildcat strike. so that the idea of organizing into trade unions, although it preceded the recognition of these trade unions, the recognition of these trade unions in law was one of the major issues that faced us in St. Lucia and in other parts of the Caribbean as well, from Jamaica right across down to Trinidad and to what was then British Guyana. So collective, and even after the recognition of trade unions in the early part of the century, or not in the early part of the century, sorry, in the 1930s and into the 40s, we still did not have the right to collective bargaining. Even when, for example, especially workers in the public service found that they needed to bargain collectively, they could not do that. And in fact, it was only somewhere in the 1970s that public service trade unions in St. Lucia got the right to bargain collectively, after other trade unions like the St. Lucia Workers Union, the St. Lucia Seamen Waterfront and General Workers Union, after these trade unions had in fact got that right. It was much later that the civil servants, public servants, and teachers got the right to bargain collectively. So we had all these obstacles in the way of workers being able to push their agenda and being able to achieve trade union representation in the fullest sense of the word. And then on that question, I think we have come a very, very long way since, but then we have again regressed into a situation where we think there's a lack of militancy. Sometimes there are flashes of militancy where people are bargaining for wages, etc. But in terms of the broader agenda, the broader social agenda, the broader political agenda, we are still very hemmed in and inhibited.
Your reflections on those same questions, Mr. Abdullah?
Yes, thank you, Professor. All right, so I was just looking at the book, Labor in the West Indies, and there is a photograph of the participants of the 1945 inaugural conference of the Caribbean Labor Congress. I'm not going to read out all the names, it will take too long, but if I could just pull out a few. Donald Moses from Trinidad and Tobago, a Dr. E.F. Gordon from Bermuda, Vera Bird, Antigua. There was a G.A. Glean, Grenada. There was someone from Suriname, Mr. C. Lisperan, Harold T. Wilson, Antigua. There was Theo Lee from Guyana, Hubert Critchlow, Guyana. T.A. Marishaw from Grenada, Grantley Adams, Barbados, Albert Gomes, Trinidad, Ralph Mentor, Trinidad, and so on. Frank Walcott, Barbados, and so on. So there are quite a few names from 1945, which was one of the early, by this time there were many formal trade unions established. In 1937, 38, there weren't as many formal trade unions established. And therefore the labor movement was led by radical activists. In Trinidad, I mentioned Elmer Francois, Christina King, Jim Barrett. There was Rupert Gittins, who was a Marxist, who later became a Roman Catholic priest. You had Clement Payne, who was from Barbados, but was in Trinidad, was part of that movement, went back to Barbados and started the strike movement in Barbados. Of course, and a number of others that you'd have had, Grantley Adams in Barbados and Quinton O'Connor in Trinidad, and many others. So I'm sure that the history students could do some research. There are books that will detail a lot of the names of persons who are active. And Verena, I'm sure you could share the names of Jamaica. Alexander Bustamante was very active, but there were others in the 1938 strike. Let me just say that E.R. Blades, Albert Redvers Blades, who died at about 109, was the first General Secretary of the Oilfields Workers Trade Union. So I knew him. And he gave us the story about how they organized. And it was very interesting. I'll just share in 1 minute. The workers in the oil fields on the 15th of July met with the governor at the time, the British colonial governor, who came down to the oil fields to find out, the strike had basically ended, to find out what was happening. And he meant to meet with the oil company executives. But the workers stopped him and said, you have to meet with us first. And they then outlined all of their problems, and he then said to them, and in the minutes of the first meeting of the union, which Blades wrote, there was a very interesting line which said, as recommended by Sir Murchison Fletcher, the governor, we should organize a trade union. And I could never understand that. But Murchison Fletcher actually said, listen, gentlemen, I can't help you as governor. The best thing for you to do is to actually organize a trade union. And that very night, the workers held the first meeting of the Oilfields Workers Trade Union at one Mr. Williams' quarters, Coonstown. An interesting name, Coonstown, which was racist, but that was the barrack yard community in this particular oil field, Faizabad. And then by the 25th of July, they were able to pull all the workers, representatives from the different oil fields, to have the first conference of delegates, the founding conference of delegates. And that was when Adrian Kohler Rienzi, who was a central person, became elected the president general of the OWTU. And then sugar workers wanted to join OWTU. And Rienzi and Moses and Blades and others said, you have to have your own union. And that is how the All Trinidad Sugar Estates and Factory Workers Trade Union was organized. But the leadership of the All Trinidad Sugar Estates and Factory Workers Trade Union was virtually the same as the leadership of the Oilfields Workers Trade Union. And what was significant was that oil workers at the time were principally African and sugar workers were principally Indian. And so you had the leadership of these two unions being the same, bringing oil workers and sugar workers together in common cause. So I just thought I'd give that little part of the history. Currently, major challenge, of course, is the fact that the unionization rate has gone down. In Trinidad and Tobago now, it's probably about just under 20% of the labor force is unionized. 40 years ago, it might have been closer to 40% of the labor force being unionized. And that's a major challenge. And a lot of workers are working in jobs that are not permanent and very difficult to organize. I'll stop there. Yeah.
And we know, of course, that a continuing problem, this happened even in before the 1930s and leading up to 1930s, 40s. Agricultural workers who are among some of the most marginalized are really not in unions. So this continues to be an issue. But from Facebook and YouTube, can you elaborate on the impact of the marginalization of trade unions in the ongoing struggle against capitalism and racism? If you think you have covered these questions already, just say so. But this one has come in. Let me say it again. Can you elaborate on the impact of the marginalization of trade unions in the ongoing struggle against capitalism and racism? David, continue.
Yeah, sure, thanks. This is critical, and George was referring to it again, that once unions focus only on the industrial aspects, which is what the colonial agenda was, namely focusing only on wages and conditions of work, then yes, unions will become more and more marginalized because the struggle against capitalism and against racism is, of course, a broader societal issue where you have to mobilize workers who are not members, but who are being exploited and so on, and to fight for what we could call a political agenda, an agenda for major transformation. I have offered the idea that we need in Trinidad and Tobago to evolve from the first republic. Of course, we've been a republic since 1976, but our institutions of state, the way in which the parliament works, the cabinet or the executive works, the judiciary, the criminal justice system, the economic system, all of those things really have not changed from colonialism to now. So we have political independence and we have our own people who elect into office. So we are in charge of our own affairs, but the system that they're operating is no different in essence from the colonial system. And until we confront that, we are not going to be able to get social justice and fairness and end discrimination in our societies, whether it be discrimination by race or by color, by gender, and so on. And the union movement has to get back that consciousness that this is a central responsibility of theirs.
Before I bring in Mr. Goddard for the other question, you mentioned quite a number of male activists We have only so far learned about one woman. But I'm going to ask the students to go and read Women in Caribbean History, which came out of the history department at Mona. Women in Caribbean History has quite a list of them. I don't have it on my where I am right now, so I'm just pointing the students to Women in Caribbean History, put out by the history department at Mona. I edited it, so they can do that. So for Mr. Goddard, here's a question that came in from, again, our Facebook. Left out, let's see, the COVID-19 has drastically changed our modern relationship to work and labor. How have the unions adapted to face these changes in the ways they represent workers and workers' rights? So this is for Mr. Goddard. I'll repeat while you get ready. And remember to unmute yourself, Mr. George. Again, COVID-19 has drastically changed our modern relationship to work and labor. How have the unions adapted to face these changes in the ways they represent workers and workers' rights? Over to you, Mr. Goddard.
Yes. First of all, I want to say that one of the things that is very, very critical at this point, before I go to the COVID-19 question, one of the things very critical at this point is the matter of precarious labor. And for example, this has made it very difficult for the trade unions, even within the context of COVID-19. It was so before, but more so now. We have precarious labor in the sense that people come in, people at the call centers, for example, which have become very popular with our governments.
You just hold on 1 second. I think someone's mic is open. I'm just asking everyone to mute when you are not speaking. So that reduce the background sounds. Yes, Mr. Goddard, please continue.
Yes. Call centers. People are hired for campaigns, during campaigns, unlimited contracts, and that makes it very, very difficult for workers to be organized. So this is one of the challenges that we have had for some time now. Now, these challenges have become even more accentuated during the period of COVID-19. And the trade unions have been trying to adapt to this by pressing these employers to find other modes other than just hiring people for campaigns. We have been trying to ensure that governments do not just acquiesce to this model of doing business, where people more and more are being hired, large numbers of people are being hired on limited contracts. Years ago, we had a situation where people were being hired in the garment industry and even at hotels seasonally. And one would have thought that at a somewhat higher degree of technology that we were going to be in a situation where that was going to regress into the past. It has not happened. With the call centers and with some of these so-called employment, where you're talking about artificial intelligence, there is a very, very high turnover of labor. So it makes it very, very difficult for people to be represented because there's a lack of that continuous employment. There's a lack of that ongoing solidarity that you need to organize workers. So the question of adapting to that situation, and you see, the thing too is employers are now saying that, look, we cannot give you any guarantee that we are going to keep people on because COVID-19 has made it very difficult for us. So in a lot of cases, lots of people have gone home and there is no guarantee that these people are going to be called back. And even workers now, having gone home, are being asked to be made redundant, even if they do not know where the next job is coming from. So the trade unions are grappling with this. One of the issues is to try to ensure that for as long as possible, these workers are kept on. But in doing this, you need the cooperation and you need the assistance of your political directorate, and very, very often you do not have this. I also want to add very, very quickly that I think you asked a question about women in the whole labor struggle. I think it should be noted here that in 1935, the coal carriers strike in the port of Castries, St. Lucia, was predominantly, in fact, was essentially a strike by women. So they started the ball rolling, which escalated in later years.
And let me apologize to my brother Earl Bousquet. I know that you've had your hand up. I just want to give the preference first to the students and teachers who have been posting questions so that I could ask those first. There's just one more before I give the floor to my brother Earl Bousquet. And it is that they continuing on in the same vein of capitalism and the ways in which capitalist preference or interest have dominated. There has been a growing transition of workers from full-time with benefits to contract workers without benefits. And do you have a comment on this in terms of the impoverishment, the growing impoverishment of our people in the region? Because in fact, that's related, I think, to what is being asked about the health situation and your answer about the COVID-19 scenario. Because, and I go back to, I suppose, the reparation, because at the moment of independence, the independence negotiators did not get a kind of Marshall Plan, or as Professor Beckles always says, a Colombo Plan like others. Therefore, we were unable to structure education, health system, social infrastructure in the way we should, so that the workers have and our people, the masses of Caribbean people, have actually been impoverished. And I don't know what defense the unions have against this growing impoverishment. And again, because of the transition from full-time workers with benefits, health insurance, and so on, to people who are contract workers with not enough money to go and take out these insurance policies on their own. So I just wanted that as a final comment, and then I would take Mr. Bousquet. You can address that since you have the floor, and then Mr. Abdullah will give his perspective. Mr. Goddard?
Yes. So continuing essentially from where I left off, it is precisely this issue of more and more deregulated labor, where so-called investors are insisting that they have more of a deregulated labor field at their disposal. It is because of that, and governments feel that their backs are against a wall and they have to accept this kind of so-called investment. That you have a situation that even where you are pressing your political directorate, your politicians to try to ensure that we do not have to acquiesce to this kind of deregulation of labor. It is precisely because of that we are finding it increasingly difficult, and that there is an increasing marginalization of labor. Now, the tourism industry, in which St. Lucia is heavily into, as we have transitioned away from agriculture, particularly bananas, the tourism industry has always been, to some extent, in fact, to a very large extent, has been of a certain precarious nature, where you have had seasonal employment. You have also had this in the garment sector, but even now, as I mentioned earlier, in so-called newer sectors, like the coal sectors, like talking about right now, you know, you're going in and you're not, after a campaign, you don't know whether you're going to be employed for the next campaign. You do not know how many campaigns you're going to be employed for. And so you do not have, as you've pointed out, you do not have the benefits. You do not have the continuity of employment that one needs. A worker, for example, cannot go to the bank and take out a loan or take out a mortgage. And these people are existing on the brink at all times. So, and as I said, with COVID-19, it doesn't look as if it is going to get better anytime soon, because employers are insisting that we cannot give you any guarantee that we are going to keep on the people, even the people that we had employed under what we traditionally call open-ended contract. So it is a very serious issue for us. I am not sure that we can clearly see the light at the end of the tunnel. And in fact, as I say, even pre-COVID, it was a direction in which employers and so-called investors were moving anyway.
Okay.
Thank you very much. David, yes. And then I'm
Yes.
going to bring in Earl.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Professor. And thank you for George for that. I want to say that this issue of insecure work, what is generally known now as precarious work, and we have moved from the proletariat to the precariat. In other words, workers who are existing as precarious workers without any security, is not something that is peculiar to the Caribbean. It is a global development as a response of the neoliberal agenda, as George described, of deregulating and liberalizing capital. And it is driven by the notion that shareholder value and the interests of the shareholder and those people who therefore own shares in companies has priority over everything else. In other words, companies must seek to maximize their profits, because when profits are maximized, the share prices go up and people get more dividends. And that simply enriches those that own the majority of shares, who are limited to a very small number of people in the world today. And that is why we're getting more and more income and wealth inequality. And if there's any of the students who are interested in economics, I suggest that they Google Professor Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize winner in economics, who has written extensively about the price of inequality. So that is a key issue. Now, this situation of precarious workers affects particularly young people. Older workers who are still working will still generally be permanent, but it is our younger workers who are entering the job market, many of them with tertiary education, or even without tertiary education, with CSEC and CAPE and so on, don't find any other employment other than this precarious part-time work, short-term contract employment. And it is happening as well in our public service, whereas before, when you are employed in the public service, you more or less had a permanent job for life. Now you get these short-term contracts in the public service. And that, I speak about Trinidad and Tobago, that has been driven by governments that think that the only way they can have public servants loyal to their party is to have short-term contracts given to their party supporters and loyalists. And that's a very dangerous development. The other thing is that we have this situation of, without having a permanent job and therefore having no sense of future, a lot of our young people prefer to migrate, particularly if they have skills or tertiary education. All those who have been educated abroad and therefore get tertiary education abroad are not interested in coming back because there's no future for them at home. So what we are doing is undermining and weakening the project of nation building. And that is going to have long-term implications for us And it is part of the history of our labor market, where we were into exporting products, sugar, oil, bananas, cocoa, coffee, bauxite, whatever, or services like tourism and so on. And what we are now into is exporting people, our skilled people. And that is undermining our nation building in two senses. One, that we're losing critical human resources that are necessary to build and develop our countries. And secondly, if our young people don't feel a sense of being rooted here, they don't feel a sense of ownership of something, then what's the purpose of my contributing to the nation? Because there's nothing in it for me. I don't have a stake in the process. And so this has a particular implication for Caribbean development. So I just wanted to add to what George said in terms of the labor market issues.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to call on my brother Earl now to speak, but I would like to put you on the alert, Mr. Goddard and also Mr. Abdullah, that I'm going to give you each 2 to 3 minutes to say make some closing statements. If for any reason there's something you didn't say, I can't imagine that, but just give 2 to 3 minutes of closing before we end today. There are no more questions coming in from more students. So Earl, you have the floor.
Thank you. I simply wanted to respond to 3 things said earlier. There were several references to the naming of and honoring through memorials of earlier contributors to the various labor movement struggles. And there is now another regional opportunity, because we have to always remember that the whole reparations issue is a CARICOM project subscribed to by CARICOM governments, and it is all being done through the CARICOM Reparations Commission, which also has launched and is in different levels of operation a renaming project in which national reparations committees are being invited to join with other stakeholders in the reparations movement and identify those institutions, buildings, roads, communities that have been named after people who contributed to the to slavery and oppression and all of that, and to see how best there could be national consensus on renaming them in the name of many of those persons whom we have forgotten, and not only in the trade union movement, but those who have gone before us and contributed to where we are today. So I thought I should mention the CRC's renaming project. You can call it naming or renaming, whichever we want to do. Just a clarification to assist George. When he spoke earlier, he mentioned Mr. Brown. His name was W.G. Brown of St. Kitts and Nevis, who was also deported for his association with the trade union movement. There was also an employer called Clinton Evans, who, if my memory serves me well, was also deported. He was from Bermuda. And on the final issue of George making the point that women were among the 1935 coal strike, led the 1935 coal strike, I also wanted to add that in the case of St. Lucia, women, and I suspect in many other Caribbean territories, women on sugar and banana estates in the pre-independence period led, for example, to the formation of the Farm and Farm Workers, Farm and Farm Workers Union in St. Lucia, which in the 70s was agitating for a minimum wage for farm workers. And women also loaded the bananas onto the boats, not only in St. Lucia, but throughout the Windward Islands. So I wanted to make these 3 points quickly.
Well made, Brother Earl. Thank you so much for that. And now I'm going to call on our speakers in the order in which they spoke today to give their final thoughts. So Mr. Abdullah, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Professor. Let me just quickly say that there was in 1937, June 19th, when Corporal Charlie King was killed in Faizabad, on that day when he tried to arrest Tubal Riba's butler. The crowd, of course, jumped on him and he was burned to death. And it is alleged that there was a woman who did that act. Her name was Esther Roberts. She's died now, and I always try to ask her about it, but she never spoke about it. But women were very active in that 1937 movement as well. And Professor Reddock has written a book for your students' benefit in terms of women and labor, or women in the labor movement and the struggles of labor. I don't have the exact title, but if you Google Professor Rhoda Reddock, who I know you know very well, you would get that important book about women in labor in Trinidad and Tobago. Let me just say that to our students in particular, and I'm so glad that you are doing history, and I agree, Professor, that we need to have history as a compulsory subject all the way through our school curriculum. And so I would encourage our history students to pursue history so that you could be the teachers of history going forward, and to solidify the importance of history in our learning about ourselves and forging our Caribbean identity, and in what Prime Minister Gonzalez always speaks about our Caribbean civilization. So I just wanted to say that. I also wanted to say that to our students, don't fall for the trap of the demonization of the trade union movement. There's a lot of demonization of the trade union movement that has gone on. And yes, the trade union movement has many faults. George and I have spoken about some of those this morning, but there has been a systematic attempt, and it's affected through the media and in other ways, to demonize the trade union movement as being irrelevant, that they're dinosaurs and a whole set of other things. And we need not to fall for that, because ultimately, the trade unions have the critical role to defend workers and workers' rights at the workplace, whether it is in this era or the era of the 30s. Trade unions are perhaps as relevant or more relevant today, given the fact of deregulated, liberalized capital and the growing inequality of wealth and income in our societies. And that is really all that I want to say, and to thank you for allowing me to share some thoughts. I did do a lecture some time ago in St. Lucia, the Sir George L. Charles lecture for the St. Lucia Labour Party, when I did speak about the role of the trade union movement in contemporary society, something to that effect. It's up on YouTube, so you could find it, and I may have addressed some other issues that I didn't speak about today. But I was very happy to identify with that lecture series.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Goddard, your final thoughts? You're muted, Mr. Goddard. Your final thoughts, please.
Yeah. I would like to point out that I think it is very, very important for the trade unions, again, to take up a role of political advocacy. Somewhere in the 1950s and 1960s, they went to ensure, especially with the British government involvement in the development of our trade union movement, they ensured that our trade union movement was depoliticized. I think right now there must be that political advocacy again, especially in a situation where political elites have been co-opted. And so I think it is very, very necessary, especially when we see that there has been an intensification as far as the marginalization of our working class is concerned. It is very, very important that we pick up these cudgels again. A lot of our trade union leaderships have been virtually made to think that it is an article of faith, that it is wrong to be quote unquote political, that you are branded if you are political. I think that must go, and we must recognize the need for strong political advocacy, not just for industrial advocacy. I also want to support Comrade Abdullah in pointing out that our young people must begin to recognize that unions are not passé. I know that in the society, there is an idea abroad for years, they have been pushing this, that trade unions are passé, that when you get a job in a hotel or at a call center or any one of these newfangled places that the new industries now, that you have to protect it as an individual. There's an individualism that has crept into our society, that solidarity has been undermined. I think the broad solidarity in our society, and especially among our young people, must be nurtured at this point. And probably we as the more senior people in the society, and especially within the trade union movement, because it is very unlikely that our politicians will do it, I think we should try to foster that, that spirit of solidarity among the youth, and so that they can see it as the only way forward, the only way they can advance not just their interests, but the interests of the society as a whole.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Abdullah, let me just say that the book you're searching for is by Professor Rhoda Redder. It's called Women, Labor and Politics in Trinidad and Tobago. I do have it on my shelf. And there's another collection in which Rhoda played a part. She co-edited with Shobita Jain, Women Plantation Workers. And it's like the first thing you read before you go on to say why the other women would have joined the struggle later on. Because and I think both of you reminded us that the trade union movement didn't just emerge in the 1930s, but had a long genealogy. And I made some statements agreeing with you about that. So I want to thank everyone for joining, and to say that sometimes when we think about the role of women and men in trade unionism, we have to also think about women who may not be marching on the streets. They may not have marched on the streets, but they wrote and they gave lectures. So I'm thinking, for example, of Amy Bailey in Jamaica, Una Marson, Catherine Mackenzie, and Mary Morris Knibb. And I'm also thinking about the ways in which we have to link the labor movement with the franchise movement and the movement towards independence, because it was one long struggle from 1492. And in fact, the struggle is continuing, a luta continua, as we say when we think about South Africa and the struggles on the continent. So it's a protracted struggle for justice, for anti-colonialism, for decolonialism and decolonization and decolonial justice. It's not finished. And I have to say, when I listen to both of you and your comments about the continuing problems of workers, I say to myself, but social injustice will bring social unrest, because this is part of our history. So even now with COVID-19, with the kind of stopgap measures that politicians are using, as kind of handouts, packages to those who are affected, it's not sustainable. And we have to shift this inequality, this social inequality that still dogs our communities across the Caribbean. Otherwise, again, history has taught us that from time to time, and we have all the evidence, the workers and the people will rise up when their backs are against the wall and when they say enough don't be enough and we can't take anymore. So those are my closing comments, and I give the last word now again to my brother Earl Bousquet, who will give the vote of thanks. Over to you, Mr. Bousquet.
Thank you so very much, Professor Shepherd. And we've come to the end of another very inspiring and hopefully effective and helpful lecture as our students across the region prepare for the history exams, which are very soon and will also be done online. We want to thank all those who made it possible across the region and in St. Lucia. From a regional standpoint, the CARICOM Reparations Commission, the Center for Reparations Research, the Special Joint CRR and NRC committee organizing this series. They are among those who work behind the scenes, whose faces we don't see on the screens, but without whose contributions we wouldn't see each other. And these include John Schotter, Michael Hilton, Dr. Sandra Gift, Gabriel Hemmings, and our newest member, Carlton Peter Antoine, representing the New Grenada Reparations Commission. In case you didn't know, since our last lecture, the 12th Reparations Commission has been established, and that was in Grenada, which held its first activity on the 19th of May and will be having a second one on the 30th of May. We also want to thank the UWI Open Campus Marketing and Communications Department, David Foster, and the team who are responsible for us being able to see each other today and to communicate as we have done. We want to thank Nationwide FM and the Talking History program, and Professor Shepherd, as we know, is the host of that program. And we want to thank the Caribbean Rastafari organization, as well as the Ministries of Education in the Windward Islands, who have joined in coordinating to ensure that various schools participate in these lectures that are only 2 hours long once a month. And at the local level, we want to thank the UWI Open Campus St. Lucia, the Nobel Laureates Festival Committee, the Monsignor Patrick Anthony Folk Research Center, Sir Arthur Lewis Community College, the National Youth Council, the Archaeological and Historical Society, the Ionola Committee for the Advancement of Rastafari, and our latest stakeholder partner, Calabash TV, which is carrying the program live and recording also for a replay. And last but by no means least, our two presenters, Mr. Goddard and Mr. Abdullah. Your contributions certainly have inspired not only our students, teachers, and persons of school, but also those of us who are participating in this activity. And Professor Shepard, once again, thank you for taking us through the last 2 hours, ensuring that our 8th lecture in this series is the success that it has been. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.